Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. Today I'm going to be doing my February wrap-up and telling you about some of the books that I read in the month of February. So I read 15 books in the month of February. 7 of those were unpublished books that I read for work. I work in publishing, so I can't talk about them, but I do have 8 books that I can talk to you about. So I'll go through them today, starting off with the classics. So the first book I read in February was Cousin Henry by Anthony Trollope. As some of you will know from my goals video, this year I am doing what I'm calling the Trollope Project, where I'm reading a novel by Anthony Trollope every month because he's one of my favourite Victorian authors, an author I absolutely love, and I just want to read more of his work. So this month I read Cousin Henry. Cousin Henry is one of those very interesting Victorian novels that sort of looks at inheritance. We begin the book with a landowner in Wales. He's fairly wealthy and he has a niece and a nephew, no children of his own. And he is kind of torn between his love of tradition and his love of his niece. He believes in his heart in primogeniture, in the male line inheriting, and he thinks that it would be the correct and right thing to do for his nephew Henry to inherit the estate. However, he also kind of hates his nephew Henry, and he loves and adores his niece Isabel, so he is kind of torn between his affection and what he perceives to be his duty. And basically the book follows what happens after this man dies in the kind of dispute and inheritance troubles between Isabel and Henry. I found Cousin Henry a really interesting book, especially because it mostly focuses on Henry, not Isabel, and Henry is incredibly dislikable. But at the same time, although he is a dislikable character, you do have some sympathy for him in some ways, and he's still very, very interesting to read about, and it's very interesting and different that Anthony Trollope has chosen such a dislikable man for his kind of hero in some ways, or for his main character at least. But it was quite interesting to kind of look at these inheritance disputes and this kind of theme of duty versus affection within the Victorian mindset, which comes up in terms of how Indeffa Jones feels, but also in how Isabel feels. It's a really interesting book looking at a lot of interesting themes, and I really, really enjoyed it. Another Victorian novel I read in February was Esther Waters by George Moore. This is the 3rd book I've read by George Moore. I've also read Drama in Muslin and Albert Nobbs, and I think this is probably my least favourite so far. I did really enjoy it, but it didn't pack so much of a punch for me as the other 2 things I've read by him, and I found bits of it much stronger than others. So Esther Waters follows the life of a woman called Esther Waters. At the beginning of the book, she goes into service as a kitchen maid in a grand country house, and through various circumstances, Esther ends up struggling to make her way in late Victorian England as a single parent. There are some bits of this book that I absolutely loved. The exploration of what it was like to be a single parent in Victorian England are fantastic, and the kind of middle section of this book I loved so much. I found really moving, I found really engaging and interesting and really, really powerful. However, the first third I liked, but not quite as much as the middle third, and the last third I felt to be a bit of a letdown, and in some ways I think it's partly because this is a very realistic book and it feels very much a book about real life and real people, but therefore I didn't always like the decisions Esther made, even though I kind of believed that she would make them. It made me sad that she did, and especially in the last third of the book I found it quite hard to enjoy because I so much didn't like what was happening, if you see what I mean. Even though I did believe it and it felt realistic, it also, I kind of wish this book had had a slightly different ending. And I found the very, very ending a little bit anticlimactic as well. Another thing I would say is that in this book there's quite a lot about horse racing, which I just didn't find very exciting, which is fine. And in some ways it was quite interesting because the way it kind of looks at gambling addiction, I suppose, through horse racing was quite interesting. And that theme, the theme of gambling, as well as the theme of kind of position of women in late Victorian England and the kind of position of single mothers and the position of single mothers, especially single unmarried mothers, that was really, really interesting. And the way this book looks at work as well and kind of the different jobs Esther goes through, that was all really interesting. So although this book dealt with a lot of really interesting themes, and I did find the characterisation interesting, because that final third for me wasn't as strong and was a bit disappointing, I therefore didn't entirely love it. Like, I feel like George Moore had the opportunity to make a lot of really interesting points in this book, but instead of making those really interesting points, he decided instead to write a very realistic story, and I appreciate and understand the importance of that, but I also therefore didn't love it quite as much. So yeah, I enjoyed this book. Not necessarily my favourite Victorian novel, but I'm glad I finally read it. The other classic I read in February was the last book in A Dance to the Music of Time. This is Hearing Secret Harmonies by Anthony Powell. I'm not going to talk very much about this here because there will be a full review video coming up in the next week or 2, but I enjoyed this one. It's been weird rereading this series over the last year, and it's weird to think I finally finished rereading this series because it's been such a long project. And it's also been interesting because in some ways I remembered the last ones not as much, but there were bits of this I remembered more. It's such an interesting series. I really enjoyed the final book. I do think that the first half of the series in general I love more than the second half, but this final book is really interesting, really powerful, really strange, and yeah, just such a great series. I would highly recommend it. Moving on to contemporary literature, this month I read Our Endless Numbered Days by Claire Fuller. This is a book that has been on my shelf for ages, and this was my TBR jar pick for January, not for February. I'm a little bit behind on them, but I did finally get around to reading it. I had weird expectations going into this, because when I bought it, or when I got given it for Christmas, like years ago, I was really, really excited for it because I'd heard so many fantastic things about BookTube, and I thought it was going to be fantastic and kind of a real favourite for me. And then my expectations kind of slowly went lower, but then I started reading it and I loved the writing, so my expectations got higher, but I didn't love the ending, so I have mixed feelings on it. I would say this is very much a 4-star book for me. There are things that I absolutely loved, but it wasn't perfect. And I did, as I say, I found the ending a little bit disappointing, or a little bit like... This book is a book that feels very, very original in many ways, and the very end felt unoriginal. However, the writing in this is stunning, and I'm definitely going to be picking up more by Claire Fuller in the future. I also read a short story by her this month, which I'll talk about in a minute. So Our Endless Numbers Days is quite an interesting story. It tells the story of a young girl called Peggy, and at the age of 8, Peggy is taken away from the family home where she lives with her mother and father by her father to live in the middle of nowhere in a cabin in the woods, and her father tells her that the world has ended and that they're the only 2 people still alive. And everything kind of spirals and goes on from there. That is one strand of the plot, and in the rest we follow her kind of acclimatizing back to real normal life at the age of 15. The writing, as I said, is superb in this book, and the themes it explores are really, really interesting. The only thing that let it down for me was the ending a little bit, because it just wasn't as strong for me as the rest of the book. Like, there are so many things I thought were fantastic about this, but I didn't completely love the ending. So this was a really strong book, and I'm looking forward to reading more by her in the future, though I didn't love everything about it. Then in February, I also finished listening to 2 short story anthologies on Audible. One was called Jarly, and the other was called Bard. And these were 2 short story collections that were free on Audible that Nick and I listened to together, which was really nice. So both of them had 6 different stories from different writers in them. They were both a little bit of a mixed bag. So the first collection, Jarly, was a science fiction collection, so all the stories kind of dealt with sci-fi or futuristic elements, apart from one story called Anuj, which I really enjoyed, but wasn't science fiction. I don't really know what it was doing in there. I guess it was kind of speculative, but it didn't really seem to fit with the rest of the stories in there. There were some stories which were much stronger than others. Some stories, like A Conclusion and Internal Architecture, I felt were a bit weaker, but then When Will We Get There and A Star That Sings in Darkness were really strong. But my favourite story in this collection was definitely The Magic Paintbrush by Ken Liu, which was just fantastic, like just utterly my kind of story. I did cry a little bit while listening to this. It was so strong, so good, and just fantastic. It's a story I would definitely recommend, especially because this collection is free on Audible for Audible members. It's worth downloading this collection just to listen to that one story, even if you don't listen to the rest, because it's so good and so strong. Especially because I feel like so many science fiction stories are about the dangers of technology and how kind of evil technology could become, whereas The Magic Paintbrush was a little bit about that, but also about the wonderful, creative, imaginative power of technology and how technology could also do really good things, and that was just lovely. So yeah, definitely recommend that short story. I think that individual short story is probably my favourite thing that I read in February. And then the other similar Audible anthology of collected stories that Nick and I listened to in February was called Bard, and these were kind of contemporary realist short stories that we both enjoyed listening to, like the other collection, because there were a mix of authors in here. Some of the stories were much stronger than others. There was one story in here, Story with Cacti by Adam Thirlwell, which I really didn't like. I really didn't see the point of. I really felt like that story was going absolutely nowhere. But then some of the other stories, Responsible Adult by Claire Fuller, who I've already spoken about in this video, that was a really strong story. I also loved The Wood Between the Worlds by Joanne Harris. It's definitely made me want to read more by Joanne Harris. But I think my favourite story in this collection was The Secrets by Marina Levitska, which was just wonderful. This is the author of A Short History of Tractors in Ukrainian, which I haven't read, but I now really want to, because this story was so lovely. It's about 2 elderly ladies who live in flats across the hall from each other, both of whom have lost their husbands, both of whom are immigrants to the UK from different countries and very different backgrounds, and it's just so touching and heartfelt and lovely, and I just, yeah, really great story. Again, like with The Magic Paintbrush and Jarly, I would recommend downloading the short story collection Bard, because it's free on Audible, Lots of the stories are great, but The Secrets was just wonderful. Finally, I have 2 books that I read for work that I can talk about because they are already published. They're backlist books that I've been reading to catch up for forthcoming books related to these books. So the first one was One Enchanted Evening by Anton du Beke. Anton du Beke is on Strictly Come Dancing, so you may know his name and his face from there. And One Enchanted Evening is a historical fiction book set in the 1930s in a hotel in London. It follows 2 main characters. One is Nancy Nettleton, a new chambermaid there, and the other is Raymond de Guise, who is a kind of show dancer. So in the ballroom at the Buckingham Hotel, he dances in order to kind of show the guests how it's done. And it follows these 2 characters and a really big cast of sub-characters. Like, the minor characters in this book are really, really fantastically and wonderfully drawn. And we follow these characters and kind of what happens to the Buckingham Hotel in the late 1930s, so kind of when there's lots of political tension gearing up. It's about dance and it's about family and relationships and secrets and kind of class and race. On the one hand, it is a compelling love story and a book about dance, but on the other hand, it's also a book about rising anti-Semitism in late 1930s Europe. So there's a lot of really complicated, deep stuff going on under the surface. And yeah, I really enjoyed it. I'm very excited that I get to work on the second book in the series. And then I also read Wild Like Me by Louise Pentland, and it follows a woman called Robin Wilde, and she is a single mother of a little girl called Lila, who is about 6 or 7 years old. And Robin Wilde is kind of doing okay, loves being a mother, but struggles with what she refers to as the emptiness, which I think you can take to a certain degree as being some form of kind of depression and loneliness. And it kind of looks at the pressures of being a single parent and the kind of ways in which Robin Wilde tries to balance her life. This is just fantastic fun, and I would highly recommend it. And yeah, I've got the second book in the series to read, and then I'll be working on the third book, so that's very exciting. And that is all. Those are all the books that I read in February that I can talk to you about at the moment. Please let me know down in the comments if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.